From the Flint Hills Writing Project, this is The Suggestion Box, where teachers get ideas. I'm your host, Andrea Marshbank. Today I'm pleased to be here with Tim Collins, who is an English teacher at the high school that I work at in Topeka, Kansas. Tim is a good friend of mine, and he is also our department head. Today we'll be talking about local literature, specifically to Kansas local literature, but the ideas can be taken and applied anywhere, specifically in the States. We're concerned with how can we use local literature and the authors around us to help our students feel connected to the environment that they're already in, and to see the application of writing in the real world. We'll also be chatting with Tim about how local literature has affected his world, specifically in his experience with his master's degree. We're really excited to be back from our break, and the podcast will now be published once a month around the 15th of each month. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for being here today, Tim. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrea. I'm really excited about the opportunity.
Yeah, we are too. It's going to be a really eye-opening conversation, especially because I have never, and I imagine there are lots of teachers who have, in their endeavors to find literature for whatever sorts of reasons, it is frankly, it never occurred to me past perhaps elementary school when we had, Kansas history, to find literature or to influence in my classroom, like the curriculum based on the world that's immediately around us. That was a really long-winded way of saying that I have never considered using local literature in my classroom. So I was really curious, just to start off, what sparked your interest in using local Kansas literature to use in your classroom? Why is this important to you?
It actually began in my first teaching stint at Topeka West High School. It just in the fact that after a couple years, I gained the capability of teaching creative writing. I started looking for things that I could teach, and in my research, which basically meant going to the public library, but also looking at local bookstores, both in the Topeka community and in small towns around the area. I found that Kansas has a rich tradition of poetry, as well as short story writers, novelists, and I latched on to a couple of poets and introduced those poets to my classes and was well received. And then it grew in my master's experience, which finished a couple of years ago, with basically an exploration into a deeper sense of what these poets talk about.
Well, congrats on finishing your master's.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I am in the process, and wow, that's a lot while also working as a teacher.
Oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. And a couple of our colleagues, as you well know, are going through it right now. It takes a great deal of motivation, sleepless nights, but I think it causes us to appreciate it a little bit more.
Yes, I agree. It's definitely going to be worth. I feel like my master's, I will be much more grateful walking across the stage at KU than I was for my bachelor's. Although I was very grateful for my bachelor's. This is a different kind of grateful. Like every day I'm thinking about I could just not do this kind of grateful.
I remember a few of those sleepless nights.
Yeah. So I know that your culminating project was a really large influence on your process with bringing in local literature into your classroom and on the consideration of that. And I would love to hear more about that. Could you tell me a little bit more about your experience with that?
Well, my culminating project basically was a research paper that 25 pages or more, and we could choose what it is that we wanted to focus on. And because my master's was from Fort Hays online program in liberal studies with an emphasis in literary studies, I wanted to move a bit beyond the realm of education and just make it a little bit more literary. And as a result of that, I took my passion for Kansas literature that's grown over the last couple of decades, and with the assistance of a couple of individuals, latched on to the topic of the role of landscape in Kansas poetry. And then from that, and obviously in the research and reading what others have to say, and if you step back and you look at it, it becomes a little bit intuitive that, or at least I would argue, that one cannot separate poetry from landscape, and maybe in some ways fiction. And I became fascinated with the idea of the definition of a person through place. And I think that those various items come together with allowing our students to have an avenue to better know themselves through their place. And in my various encounters with teaching a handful of poets, a couple of short stories, there's a wonderful novel called Dust that I offer as an opportunity or an option for students. I found that at first they don't see the connection, but with a little bit more introspection, they come to the realization, like, wow, I am a Kansan.
Yeah.
And these things are important to who I am.
Right. That's really interesting that you bring that up, because I was writing over here in my notepad. I wrote the words flyover state, because I think that as Kansans, there are many places in the U.S. where I feel like people have a lot of pride coming from those places. You know, I'm from New York, from California. It seems very coastal in that sense. But I think there are a fair amount of Midwest states where students, especially at our school, they foresee themselves getting out. I feel like we have very few students right now who are thoroughly excited to be placed in Topeka, Kansas, or in Kansas itself, and envision their entire lives there. And as a person who was in the similar spot as a younger person and who has now spent her entire life in Kansas and has grown to love it from a great deal of experience and just passion for the place, I think it's interesting how you're bringing in the definition of who you are through a place into the classroom. Do you see some of that? I don't want to call it animosity, because it just seems more apathetic towards Kansas. Do you see some of that attitude coming out of your students? Does this dispel that at all? Do they have more pride being a Kansan at this point?
I think depending on the literature that they experience, they gain an appreciation for the state.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to dispel that whole idea, like, I want to get the heck out of Dodge, no pun intended, in order to experience the world. But I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, but grew up my whole life in Kansas, and I wanted to get out, and I got out, but I'm back. And I've made forays to different places around the world, some fantastic and wonderful and beautiful places. But Kansas is home. And I feel more at home here than anywhere else that I've ever been. And maybe that is something else that I've not explored enough, this notion of home.
So in your culminating project, where you were exploring all of these local authors and Kansan folks who were creating these pieces of literature that you then shared with your classrooms, what were some of the most notable authors that you brought back? What were some that you could maybe recommend to our listeners too? Because we do have a lot of listeners in Kansas, since the suggestion box is based out of Kansas.
Sure.
But also just, for anybody who's listening who like wants to read a new book on poetry.
The first suggestion is going to be a little bit ironic. William Stafford, and I consider Stafford the father of Kansas poetry, although there are a handful of poets before him that were as prolific, if not more prolific, and have as profound, if not in some ways more profound poems, maybe not the number of poems that he had. But I would also argue that Stafford is one of the preeminent poets of American literature, and maybe in some ways is a little bit ignored because individuals might consider him a little bit too pastoral, a little bit too rural. And his history: grew up in western Kansas, was educated at the University of Kansas, a conscientious objector. Fascinating to hear him talk about that time of his life when he protested. Fascinating to hear about his travels when he was placed in the organization that individuals that weren't drafted, they were placed in for conscientious objectors. And it's where he gained a great deal of his education, probably gained his writing process, and more on that in just a little bit. And then Stafford, after teaching in Kansas for a short time, transplanted to Oregon, and that's where he finished his career. And he has fantastic poems about that location as well. And I think obviously so, and it kind of lends itself to the argument that landscape, and that's a huge definition when you think about it, it basically is present in all poetry. But in regards to Stafford's writing process, so first of all, as a child, the library and books were very important to both he and his family. There was a great deal of reading that went on, and in my research on Stafford has revealed that early on, because he worked in the organization that traveled around the country doing various projects during the war, he would have to wake up at 4:30 in the morning in order to get time to write. And this just followed through after his marriage and after having a family. It was his time. And that's one of the things that he talks about in a fascinating essay called You Must Revise Your Life. And what a powerful title that is.
Right.
In order to be a writer. And he talks about how a poet who has any kind of achievement really probably doesn't invent anything new. They find a way that works for them. And I read into that the way is not necessarily the how of what it is that they're writing as much as it is the discipline to be able to sit down and write. The process, which we talk about in education. On a consistent basis. And I don't see a great deal of difference between the writing of poetry and the writing of an essay, the making of a list. And if you wanted to boil it down to the rawest kernel, the same thing is happening in the brain for every individual that's doing one of those items. Like synapses are firing and muscles are twitching. The ideas are the only thing that's a little bit different.
So do you talk about these ideas with your students in the classroom?
Oh, definitely. And you hope that those things sink in. And we talk about it on a consistent basis. But process, like right now I'm teaching freshman comp, a dual credit class, and process is something that's very important to Washburn. And obviously, I want my students to have success when they go out into college. And I tell them, we investigate different types of process, and I tell them that you have to find your own way, your own method that works for you. And hopefully that method is not staying up late the night before and hammering the essay out.
Everybody's done that once or twice.
Oh, yeah.
It's just incredibly stressful.
As charged.
So maybe it's something along the lines of find your own way, your own process of writing, and then in little subscript in parentheses, it's that doesn't seriously stress you out. Well, I have Stafford down on my list for sure.
And another poet, much more contemporary, and I'm just going to lump these next few individuals together. I kind of look at them as a cadre, and I think that if somebody has an interest, it would be fascinating to see how maybe they're not like beat poets, but they are a group of poets that existed and wrote at the same time, or there's some overlapping that takes place. Vastly different subject matter, vastly different interests, but there are also these common threads. And that's another reason to, I think, teach Kansas literature or the literature of place and place it in the classroom in that through all these differences, we have common threads. I mean, Gwendolyn Brooks, fantastic African-American female poet from Kansas, and some powerful poetry and a wonderful voice if you ever get a chance to hear recordings of what it is that she said. Langston Hughes, and some new information has come to light as a result of research by Dr. McHenry at Washburn, which is kind of a humorous and happenstance in a way. But you asked about poets in my project. Those poets that I kind of lumped together are Stephen Hind and Harley Elliott, Denise Lowe, and Thomas Fox Averill, who's more of a short story and novel writer, and just recently retired, was the author in residence at Washburn University. And Elliott's poetry, he's a Salina poet, and his poetry is definitely place, but the subject matter branches out into what I would say is the human condition. He has a couple of poems that are very powerful. He has a book his first book, Animals That Stand in Dreams. And I find that quite interesting. And then Denise Lowe, who is recently retired, was an English professor at Haskell Indian College in Lawrence and taught a little bit at KU. I've actually seen some of her poems published with William Burroughs, who is a beat writer. And I have read a great deal of her work, and she's a contemporary of Eliot. And then Thomas Fox Averill, who continues to write and has a wonderful new book out, of which I can't think of the title right now, which is so bad. I haven't had a chance to get to it. Sorry, Tom. And then Stephen Hind. And in researching these individuals, there's quite a bit on Eliot. There's a great deal on Lowe. And in reality, maybe Lowe and Averill in their writing have explored enough Kansas poets that there's a canon that exists to a certain extent. But one poet that fascinated me was Stephen Hind, who grew up in Mound View outside of Emporia and now lives in Hutchinson, was an English professor at Hutchinson Community College. And he's an individual from my culminating project, an offshoot project began, and I had the pleasure to interview him. And the plan was, after the interview, to walk his property because he has some fantastic poems of place. And I hope to share a couple in just a little bit. But in these poems, basically located in the northeast part of the state near Emporia, or maybe south central is a better way to put it. So I'll back that up. So in these poems that examine south central Kansas and the location of farm, he traces history before there were human beings in Kansas, when basically we were under an ocean. And thinking about the history of our place, like right now we were at one point in time in the history of the earth underwater. And the only critters that existed were sea animals. And then after that, the buffalo and the other prairie animals that our state is famous for, the Native Americans, Coronado's forays into Kansas to try and find gold, which is always a great motivator, apparently. Yeah, and the pioneers and the amazingly remarkable ability to wake up the next morning and not have seen that your family's abandoned you. And maybe, I never thought about this before, Andrea, but I wonder about teenagers during the times of pioneers. And I'm sure they were worn out with work, but I wonder if they were that much different from those individuals that we have in the classroom now. Because in the winter, the only way they have to warm their house is buffalo chips. They've got to do terribly difficult work during the course of the day, and I know that I would want out.
So this is just, it's a cultural atmosphere of just, we need to move somewhere warmer.
Yeah, or somewhere where the toil is not so sweat and blood demanding.
Yes, mosquitoes, just the fauna supporting all of that. That's really exciting. I would love to hear some of, I believe you said this was Steve's work?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a poem that I think it does two things. The first one, it kind of connects Stafford to the time period that Steve wrote. And then the second thing, it exhibits what I was talking about earlier, the trace of history. And Stafford actually does this quite a bit, and to a certain extent, Hind and Eliot, where they play with an overlap of history, where the ages, if you will, are kind of layered, but there's a connection that exists. And it kind of comes out in the stanzas. This is from Hind's book, That Trick of Silence, 3 Days on the Prairie. And it's a 3-stanza poem. 1, Coronado. In the king's armor he troops over the green fur of the prairie to the trough of the Arkansas. A red-tailed hawk cries over the eye of a dust devil, and buzzards wheel above skulls in the yellow evening. Still he clings to the gold thighs of his dreams. Quail's call sweetens the wind as the horses drink. The noisy array strikes back for a knoll to the south. Teeth of blue stem grease taut bellies as the sun fades to a dark hide full of stars. 2, Wheel. High wheels break the morning grass on the prairie, necks polish yokes, and the whip stings the air. The hawk cries into the day, and the rabbit hunches in flowers. No thing knows what will happen next. And 3, drilling. Grain furls close to the hub of a rig, grinding its steep trail through the rock. Pickups gleam in the sun, and the roustabout hammers on steel. Dust devils rattle the grain, and a buzzard's eye holds a small steeple, clear and bright as a shrine.
Wow, I see what you're saying about the overlapping of time. It's not a flashback because that's not the the tactic that he's taking in this moment, but it is intriguing how he brings together all of these different aspects. And when you read that out loud and I hear it, I was thinking about your comment about the teenagers. None of those comments, while it might be a little idyllic and pastoral and beautiful in many ways, none of those comments to me say like Kansas is an easy place to live.
Oh yeah, there's a harshness.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. And in the poem right before the one that I read, he talks about you had talked about Kansas being a flyover state, mm-hmm. and that is actually something that Lowe discusses in a couple of her books in certain ways. But he has in the poem That Trick of Silence, this slab of land, never so much anything in the public mind as a place to get behind you from Kansas City to Denver. Get ye behind me, Kansas.
That's so intriguing. I didn't realize that this was going to come up so blatantly in the poetry. That's awesome.
Well, and I think that Hine is a poet that bears further exploration, mm-hmm. and not just from teaching, mm-hmm. But also from the perspective of who we as Kansans are, mm-hmm. Who we're evolving into. And our state, I think, is headed towards a new evolution. And we see that with the western part of the state. Will always be, most probably, hopefully, many people would say, an agricultural boon, mm-hmm. Or agriculturally centered. But I think that there is a need for Kansas to redefine itself. Mm-hmm. Now figuring that out is what's going to be interesting. Yeah. One of the things I had a great deal of difficulty, and I interviewed many contemporary poets for my project, and I would shoot them a list of poets that I was considering, and a lot of them said, like, well, I'd like to see more women on your list, or I'd like to see greater diversity. Yeah. And there are some fantastic contemporary Kansas poets, mm-hmm. Kansas writers. Sarah Smarsh, who has a new book out called Heartland, I've only read the first couple of chapters. I'm highly intrigued because I think that it's an examination of place and locale, region, mm-hmm. However you want to term it from an economic standpoint. Yeah. I think it's important to state that due to the nature of the project at Fort Hays, I had to incorporate criticism. Mm-hmm. And I started out with 3 major areas: Marxism, feminist criticism, mm-hmm. and then basically cultural studies, mm-hmm. More than anything else because of the Native American influence, mm-hmm. which, by the way, Denise Lowe is a Native American poet mm-hmm. As well. And that changed, and I decided to focus on eco-critical studies. Mm-hmm. And the poem that I read, that in the third stanza where the hawk has a steeple in its eye. It's like an invasive image, mm-hmm. so to speak, kind of like we as humans have invaded Kansas, because, again, going back to the total history of the state, and what mark have we left on nature? Mm-hmm. And I think that in my classes and talking to my students, there's little awareness of the fact that nature and humanity have a responsible relationship, mm-hmm. and we need to figure out how to be more responsible. So
your students don't acknowledge that?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah. When you're exploring these poets with them and talking to them about your research and your work through the master's program and just your interest as a professional educator and writer and person, do their opinions start to waver? Do you have certain lessons in class that maybe affect their viewpoint of that? Or is this more of like a note of the current state?
I think I would like to think that I have an impact,
Yeah.
And I would hope that I have an impact. And as an example, in sophomore English, we have our first unit is on morals and ethics, and we read Traveling Through the Dark by Stafford, and the action in the poem, the speaker is driving and comes to a bend in the road where there's a cliff, and there's a deer that's been hit, and it's dead. And it's a famous bend that many people know, and deer are there often, and many a deer has been shoved off the cliff to make way for the next human being that's going to be traveling in their car. But as the speaker of the poem gets ready to shove this deer off, he realizes that the deer is pregnant and that the unborn fawn is still alive. And so now, and there's a wonderful passage. It's, Stafford, I think, says something to the effect of, "This was my only wavering and my only hesitation. What do I do? Do I do the best thing for the next human being coming along, or do I do the best thing for nature?" And he shoves the deer off the side of the cliff. And it's a sadness I can tell in your face.
Ah!
That's what we were talking about before we began.
Man, I thought this was going to be, and then he went back to his car, and he just happened to have a surgical kit, and he saved the deer, and now they're best friends.
But that's an interesting way to term it. Like, what is our relationship with nature, and how close are we as friends, and how do we acknowledge the impact that nature has upon us and that we have upon nature? Yeah. And like I was talking about earlier, the responsibility. And I think that there's a shared responsibility in some ways.
That's so interesting. I have this brief sidebar moment that is only tangentially related, but I can't get it out of my head. And that is, we took foster kids when I was growing up. And so I had a bunch of little siblings. And one of the young women who I is still in contact with today once asked me why there are birds outside. She said, "Why don't we have them in cages? Our cats live at home, our dogs live at home.
Sure.
Why aren't the birds?" And I remember, I think I was like a freshman in high school. I was like, I don't know, get out of my room. But just this conversation, which is one that I haven't seriously considered in a long time. It comes back into my head like that. When you look over that, is it a poem or is it prose by Stafford that addresses the deer?
Poem.
So when you go through this poetry, are your students, what is their response like? And also from more of a curriculum standpoint, what do you ask of them? Do they do a writing response? How do they interact with this?
So usually we talk about or I have them go through a close reading, maybe a little bit guided, to make sure that there's an understanding of the action in the poem. They have an understanding that the speaker hesitates and wonders and thinks. And I think there's another line, "I thought hard for us all." And in that, right now I tend to think of the fact that the speaker in the poem, Stafford, is not just thinking of the speaker thinking about other human beings, but everything in the universe. And that relationship that I'm talking about and discussed a little bit in my culminating project. But in the end, once they've finished and have an understanding of the poem, I ask the question, is it ethical for the speaker to shove the deer off the side of the road? And now the student has to struggle with that. And then this is followed up, and this is a formative assignment that just gets them to write. And it's not something that I necessarily would grade. I might evaluate more for their argument as opposed to their writing. But because there's little, if any, separation between writing and thinking. I think it's important for students to, number one, be rewarded for their voice, and then number two, to see that they have an idea and their thoughts are not going to be attacked. So when I respond in kind with a sentence or two, like, "Hey, I really liked your idea here in regards to the ethics or the morals, the method that you approached." Every once in a while, I might have a student that I have to ask a question of, like, are you really certain that this is the direction that you want to go? Oftentimes, and it'd be interesting to keep data on this if I was a data sort of person. But what is the percentage of students that bring in their emotion of sadness and how they felt? But humanity always wins out, and maybe that's the way it's supposed to be.
It's hard to tell, but there is. I'm positive from your response, and also just knowing some of the students we work with that I imagine they have a pretty empathetic response to the plight of the unborn dear child.
And I am always pleasantly surprised that it's not just female, because they are sophomores, but males, even males that hunt.
Interesting.
That is their involvement with nature, and they probably, if they hunt or fish, they probably have a closer relationship to nature than most of the other students. Hind, in my interview, and I was asking him about influences, and he kept going back to the Romantics. To a certain extent, Frost, and a little bit of Stafford, and when you consider his poetry and the notion that Romantics had, that in nature, we find serendipity or atonement, or an at-one moment, using that as a word, then I think that there's something to be said for that. I find it also fascinating, moving on to contemporary poets, in regards to poets like Amy Fleury, and she is a creative writing professor at the University of Louisiana Lafayette now, but was at Washburn University for a long time. The subject matter, Kansas, what do we have? We have Barnes. And Barnes appear in Hind's poetry. Barnes appear in Eliot's poetry. To a certain extent, Lowe. Stafford, for sure. He has a wonderful poem that is so simple yet so complex. And that's one of the reasons that I think Stafford is one of the preeminent poets. But Amy Fleury has a poem in which a barn appears, and there's a religious transaction that exists in the action of the poem. And I wasn't able to find the book, but I can definitely share it with you later on today.
Yeah.
If you have an interest. And that is the other aspect of Kansas poetry. And religion can be a very loaded word, even in the context of, or especially in the context of the public classroom. But I think spirituality is something that is okay for students to explore on their own, in their own direction.
Yes, and to be frank about the experiences of Kansas, just as a whole, as a state, and as a teacher working in the school, it would be very difficult to have an active discussion. It is unsurprising to me that the poets who are locally based wrote probably at least some about religion, and it's probably something that is on the mind of, if not all, many of our students, depending on the day. So it makes sense that it's present and that it has to be discussed, even if it's through the framework of spirituality.
Sure. Yeah. Another contemporary poet takes an aspect that few realize maybe that exists. Kevin Raby, who is I believe he is the department chair at Emporia State, has a wonderful new book of poems out. It deals with jazz. And he's a jazz musician as well as being a fine established poet. And the poetry, and I've only been able to read a handful of the poems, but you can tell that it has a rhythm, a cacophony, so to speak, that appears at times, and talks about jazz music in our area, and especially Kansas City, because he plays up there semi-frequently. And Kansas City, you can say, well, is it Missouri or Kansas? But we all know it's one place. And Kansas City has a fine jazz tradition that has offshoots that exist in the Prairie. Music is another one. If you think about it, just in our conversation up to this point, we've talked about music and Native Americans and the fauna and the agricultural aspect, and these are all parts of landscape. So landscape, it's a point that I come to in my paper, encompasses everything.
To be quite frank, I hadn't realized prior to our discussions, again, previous to this podcast, that Kansas had such a riveting history of writers, and not even history, it's contemporary. These people are still, they're still here.
Sure.
Like this really exciting atmosphere and culture of writers. And it makes me wonder, just in the spirit of landscape shaping us and of the knowledge that some of our listeners from the suggestion box are from all over the country, that there are probably, if our listeners haven't investigated, it's probably worth investigating what ridership you have in your area.
Oh, I think that there's something to be said for that. There's local pride. I think definition, which we kind of talked about earlier. I think also the impact that a particular area has on the mindset of the country as a whole, even internationally. I mentioned Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes. Gordon Parks is another as far as African Americans go. Native Americans, Denise Lowe and Lucy Tapianzo, and there are more. I had the opportunity to hear Juan Morales, who's the department chair at the University of Colorado in Pueblo, talk about his writing process. And from a Latin American standpoint, focusing on his upbringing and as well as his process, where he starts all of his poetries from a journal where he writes prose and then hones them into poems. I think that's important.
Have you done that as either writing into the day with your students, or any sort of writing assignment where you've had them write prose about a landscape and then morphed it into poems?
At this point, no.
Okay.
And part of that is because the Flint Hills Writing Project is a new experience for me. Prior to going through the Institute this summer, I examined or I utilized free writing, kind of like Peter Elbow talks about, where it's almost totally free. And I've been tickled with what I picked up from the Flint Hills Writing Project, with maybe providing a prompt, but you hast permission if you want to write whatever it is that you want to do. I think that students write more based on that.
I agree. I'll have students who, I do a very similar process in my classroom. Although I don't believe, just from my knowledge of the classroom, we don't do it for as long during the front parts of the day, but I do have students who will answer the prompt in a few sentences and then move on. But I had just asked about the writing about a place with prose and then change it into poetry, because we had done that at a department meeting recently, and I thought that was an experience that tied in pretty closely to this.
And to be honest with you, I haven't thought about it as far as incorporating it into my lesson plans a great deal. But so thanks for the idea.
Yeah, you did it with all of us. I just assumed you were transplanting lessons from your kids. Like that's what I would have.
Are you kidding? I can't fool any of you guys. I've got to wake up really early in the morning to get quality prompts for.
I'm sure I'll mention this in the intro, but just to reiterate, Tim is our department head, so he runs our meetings every Thursdays.
Hey, and yesterday, having a writers group, I told Heather, one of our lead instructors, like, hey, I'm just borrowing and stealing everything that I can, and it's working wonderfully. So I'm looking forward to the next time that we get together. Yeah. That has, when I entered the Flint Hills Writing Project, I went in with the idea that I was going to continue the exploration of Kansas literature. And I was going to explore it from an educational aspect similar to what we're talking about at times. Like, hey, all you teachers of English, here's an opportunity for you if you so choose. Not just in Kansas, but Nebraska, as you were talking about earlier. Right. There's some wonderful Nebraska writers, and it goes for I would say all 50 states and all countries in a lot of different ways. But while I was at the Flint Hills Writing Project, I became interested in the evaluation of student writing, and I've always been a little bit of a rebel when it comes to grading student writing, and so my current thought or my current exploration right now is just looking at that and coming up with new ways to evaluate, or exploring ways that already exist that others have. But in the future, I would like to continue with this project, and I know that at Washburn University on their website, they have a map of Kansas literature, and Tom Averill is the individual that began that, and he and another professor at Washburn have written a grant, and they're getting ready to revamp the website. And we had discussions about including lesson plans for teachers K through 12, maybe K through 16, in which a teacher could go and they could find a canned lesson plan that meets standards, so their Kansas board are ready to go, and allows for them to pick and choose literature from a geographical area in Kansas that maybe they want their students to explore. Maybe a geographical area that is totally different from where it is. Maybe transplanted Kansas, Kansan educators get to reach back into the state and find something that is a connection. And that's one of the wonderful things for me as far as education goes, is this incredible network, and it's kind of like in the universe anyway, this incredible network of connections. It's like a web, and on the one side of the web, there's a little tweaking that goes on, and you start heading over there, and then there's a tweaking that goes over to the other, and we as spiders start heading to that one. But maybe we migrate around to all these different places in the web. The web grows because we just make more connections in our lives.
Yeah, what a wonderful resource that would be for any teachers who are interested in working with Kansas literature but didn't have a place to start. That would be just a great baseline from which they could grow, and maybe if it was built in such a way, have an opportunity to give back to that too. So that's exciting.
And if you go to the website, like it has the major communities in Kansas highlighted, and then individuals that are either from that area or from near that area, and it has biographical information, example works, sample works, as well as links that exist that a teacher can point to.
Yeah.
I know that in my culminating project, Tom Averill was instrumental in assisting with that, and his efforts and his passion, triple if not quadruple mine for Kansas literature.
Yeah.
When the man personally knows so many of the individuals that, number one, that appear on the map. Number two, he's a little bit more in tune with the current group of poets and writers that exist in Kansas. But he reminds me of my favorite English professor from college, who is always looking to connect students with things that would improve or enhance their own interests. And maybe in some ways that's like a Kansas thing. So I see you do that sometimes with your students.
With what? Could you give me?
Sure. Like a student comes to you, or you're talking to a student and you're like, oh, you have an interest in this. Have you seen this?
Oh, okay.
Or heard this? Or here's something for you to explore.
See, and I think that's a teacher thing.
Well, it could be.
Maybe Kansas just has the best teachers. We said it here. We're not going back.
I'll go with that.
Yeah, that's it. We have the Flint Hills Writing Project. We've got Dr. Heather and Roger Caswell. Like we're 10 steps ahead, folks. That sounds really, really exciting, and it's awesome that Tom Averill had such a great influence on that. We had actually reached out to him in the process of looking for a speaker for the writing club for an author, and I had found a list of Kansas authors that were that had presented at some festival last year. I just happened upon a list on Google, and it had all their email addresses, and I just forwarded out a bunch of emails to local authors, which, by the way, if you're an English teacher or an elementary school teacher or a writing sponsor, or if you're this is a good strategy to use for any sort of subject that you want an expert in to come into your classroom. But I had a plethora of responses, so many responses that we could not possibly host that many authors at our writing club meetings. But Tom was one of the first to respond.
He came to my creative writing class last year and read an excerpt from his new book. It was fascinating because it's written in letters.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to teachers who are interested in using local literature or finding local literature, local authors, and incorporating that into their classroom in some way, shape, or form? What things could they do that might make their process a little easier?
Well, at this point in time, I think there's no better example than yourself in what you've done for the kids in our writing club here at Seaman High School, where you reached out on Facebook and said, yo, anybody know of any Kansas authors?
Yeah.
And then you get a wonderful response for that.
There were so many, everybody listening, so many. It was a little overwhelming, but in a great way.
Sure. And then maybe, we sometimes as teachers get lost in our own little world. We're in the classroom. Maybe we miss out on certain things that are going on in the community. But I know that in Salina, that they have regular readings, and there are poets that are in the Salina area that attend. I know in Hutchinson, they have regular readings. I know in Wichita, there are many different readings. The Kansas City area, Lawrence, obviously, Topeka. And I thought I had my finger on the pulse here in Topeka. And then I went to a poetry slam at Highland Park High School in the spring, and I was blown away. There were 3 events I had no clue took place, and one of them is just down the road in Noto. And shame on me on thinking that I know everything. But the next place is the map of Kansas literature that exists at Washburn University. Perusing that, and one can come up with ideas. And as English teachers, I think that we're wonderfully creative. By maybe it's a curse, maybe it's a blessing, but in looking that over, we find ways to connect whatever theme or essential question or big idea that we're looking at with something that goes on there. And then finally realizing that we have a responsibility to propagate literacy through supporting local authors. And what I mean by that, we can write and should write so that we know what our students are going through. But we have to support local authors in order to promote those ideas that are important to us. We are not too far removed from Common Core and the idea that maybe nonfiction is way more important to teach than fiction. And, we're delving in something from a literary criticism standpoint that affects education. Like Plato said, there shall be no poets in the Republic because poets tell the truth. And we have a duty to our students to tell the truth. And as English teachers, we should be searching the truth and the different ways that it's communicated.
Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciated it. This conversation is one that will resonate with me for a long time, so I appreciated it, and I imagine that we have a lot of teachers who are listening who are interested in literature and in the process of writing that also found interest here, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to talk about something I really care about and am passionate about. And it's my first ever interview, like podcast-wise.
You're famous now, just so you know. We have stickers that say that. So
I want one for the back of my car so I can put it on my bumper sticker.
Yes. I love it. Oh, man. Well, thank you so much.
Sure thing. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much to our listeners out there who are listening today. If you enjoy the Suggestion Box podcast and want to support us, please leave a review on iTunes or subscribe. We're also on Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Our social media is Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. All, if you search in the search bar, the Suggestion Box podcast, we will pop right up. An extra special thank you out there to Dr. Heather and Roger Caswell, who make this podcast happen every day. They are the directors of the Flint Hills Writing Project, and therefore just kind of magical wizards. So thank you so much to them, and also to Kristen McGriff, our lovely graphic designer. And of course, thank you to Tim for giving us a marvelous interview today. If you or someone you know is interested in being on the Suggestion Box podcast, please give us a holler. We're over at the suggestionboxpodcast.com, as well as the Suggestion Box podcast at gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Well, see you next time, teachers.